Hi everyone, so today we're going to be talking about the conscription crises of both World War I and World War II using the 5 W's. So what exactly is a conscription crisis and what is conscription in general? Conscription is when men are conscripted to war by the government, also known as forced war, and a conscription crisis is the political and military disagreement on whether men should be forced or conscripted to war. This military disagreement happened twice, both World War I and World War II. Let's start with talking about World War I's conscription crisis. Who was all involved in the conscription crisis of World War I? All of Canada was involved, both the government and its citizens. The Prime Minister was Robert Borden at the time, the 8th Prime Minister of Canada, who at the time was part of the Conservative Party. He had earlier promised Canada that there would be no conscription, but when he realized that maybe conscripting may be necessary, he signed on the Military Service Act, which made enlistment compulsory. The crisis most definitely involved the Canadian citizens, specifically the ones living in Quebec, the French Canadians. Not many of them felt that it was their duty to fight and were upset and affected by conscription. They saw the Military Service Act as a way of forcing them to fight a war that was not theirs. So where was the conscription crisis in World War I? It of course was in all of Canada, but had the greatest effect in Quebec, where the most opposition was to conscription. When was the conscription crisis of World War I? The conscription crisis was in 1917 and 18. So why exactly was there conscription in World War I, and why did it have to be a crisis? The reason for conscription was that after the Battle of Somme, compelled with other war efforts, Canada was simply down too many soldiers. They tried to recruit, but with that failed, they were forced to conscription. There were several reasons that this then became a crisis. First of all, the French Canadians were very opposed to this. One French nationalist, Henri Bourassa, said that Canada had lost enough men and spent too much money already, and that conscription would divide the nation. It also angered some farmers in the prairies who needed their sons home to work on the farm, and also industrial workers who didn't want to give up their job when they went to the war. Though there were exemptions in some of these situations, people claimed that it was not enough. The aftermath and ending of the World War I conscription crisis. With such disagreement over conscription, Robert Borden called an election. Before the election, though, Robert Borden passed 2 pieces of legislation to almost ensure his re-election. This legislation didn't allow conscientious objectors to vote, as well as not allowing new immigrants to vote. With this in place, Borden won the election, but Quebec definitely still showed its disapproval. Following this, there were many anti-conscription riots, causing casualties for some people. Overall, there was a major divide between English and French Canada. Now let's look at the World War II conscription crisis, similar in many ways to the one previous to it, but with having the wisdom of what happened in World War I to help make better changes for this conscription crisis. So who was all involved in the World War II conscription crisis? It involved the whole country, led by Mackenzie King, the current Prime Minister at the time. He was experiencing a lot of pressure from Britain to conscript, because Britain wanted more military help. King was very apprehensive and did not want to conscript because the crisis it had caused in World War I. The crisis also involved Quebec, who was again the strongest opposition because they felt that they had no obligation to fight with or for Britain. Where was the conscription crisis of World War II? The conscription crisis took place, of course, in Canada, with the most effect lying in Quebec, where the greatest opposition to conscription was. So now looking at the when was the conscription crisis. The conscription crisis of World War II was in 1944. So why was there conscription and why was there conscription crisis? The reason for conscription in World War II was similar to World War I in that more men were needed and there was no more people willing to volunteer, but Canada needed to offer more men to the war. The reason this was a crisis is because the people in Quebec, as well as farmers and other Canadians, were not impressed with the conscription decision and did not want to have to be conscripted. Aftermath of the conscription crisis of World War II. In this time, the French and English Canadians were definitely divided, especially on their thoughts of war and fighting for Britain. But many people think that Mackenzie King's approach to conscription and how he dealt with it in a cautious way definitely didn't worsen the French and English-Canadian relationships any more than they could be. In total, only 12,000 soldiers were sent overseas, and not many of them had passed. In summary, both these conscription crises of both World War I and World War II are good lessons on how Canada dealt with issues that arose and controversies in between its people, especially the English and French. Just have a quick question for you guys. Do you think conscription was the right choice for Canada? Thanks for watching. Bye.